Chiziaruhoma Ogbonda. I'm a mobile developer at firstblood.io, and I'll be talking about Flutter architecture with Riverpod. First of all, what is Riverpod? First of all, what is Riverpod? Riverpod is a state management library, group of libraries that provides a simple way to access state from anywhere in your application while robust and testable. So many of us may be asking, why do we need a new state management library? Everyone's like, okay, they're like they're existing state management libraries and everything. Why do we need a new one? But um, there are lots of reasons why we need one. There are like totally so many reasons why we need newer, better state management libraries, like uh, like Riverpod. Riverpod is basically like provider because it was created by the same person. So there are lots of similarities between Riverpod and provider, but there are also differences between provider and Riverpod. So the first question we might ask ourselves is, why Riverpod? Why do I have to switch from my existing state management library to use Riverpod? What is so special about Riverpod, and why do I need to use it? The first one is Riverpod doesn't depend on Flutter. So if you're working with the Flutter project, definitely you would need state management, but consider a different process or a different project where you're not working with Flutter, but you also might need to manage states. This is where Riverpod comes in, and it can also give you methods or ways to handle states in only that projects or projects that do not depend on Flutter. Number two is Riverpod without its limitations. Number two is provider without its limitations. Riverpod gives us a way to use providers without their limitations. So this is like provider, but a better version of provider without specific limitations that we had previously while using provider for state management. Number three, Riverpod helps us declare states from anywhere. So Riverpod is like different. Riverpod is like a state management library that helps us or gives us the ability to declare states from anywhere on our application. You could declare states in your UI in a different class altogether, or in a different method, or probably anywhere you want to use your state. You could define it there, declare it there, and use your state there. The fourth one is Riverpod helps computing states stroke rebuilding UI only when needed. So Riverpod helps in computing your states, rebuilding your UI only when you need it. This approach is basically like a take what you need approach. It takes only what you need. You could rebuild only the widgets or specific values that you want at specific times. You don't have to specify it to change everything when the widget tree is being rebuilt. You just have to specify it to change specific values and change only what you need at that particular time. The fifth one is the inbuilt handling of loading and error cases. So the Riverpod library gives us different methods to, or it gives us a method actually to handle inbuilt loading and error cases. So in case your data doesn't load, it gives you a method to handle this particular case. If your data is loaded, or when your data is being loaded, it can give you the different value from when your data is loading and when your data probably throws an error, or when loading your data throws an error. So these are the different cases that Riverpod can give us. Getting started with Riverpod, there are like different ways or different things that we should know before we get started with Riverpod. There are like multiple ways of using Riverpod. So basically, we have to check out the different ways of using Riverpod. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what package do we install, or what packages do we need to work with the Riverpod project? Before anything, you need to be aware that Riverpod is spread across multiple packages with slightly different usage. The variant of Riverpod that you would want to install depends on the application you are making. You can always refer to this table. There's a particular table here that could help you decide which package you are to use when working with Riverpod. There are like three types of libraries when you're using Riverpod you could use, or three types of configurations, as I like to call them, when you're using Riverpod. The first one is using Riverpod with the Flutter hooks library. The Flutter hooks library is a library that extends various methods and gives us a way to reduce boilerplate code when working with Flutter widgets. It's basically a port from React hooks, and it's an implementation of React hooks in Flutter. So it's a Flutter hooks. When working with Flutter hooks, we would use the hooks Riverpod library. It's a way to use both Flutter hooks and Riverpod together while offering small extras, tiny little features or advancements while working with Flutter hooks. The second method is Flutter only. We could use only Flutter while working with Riverpod and not have to worry about an extra library like Flutter hooks. It's a very basic way of using Riverpod, which does not depend on any Flutter any Flutter external libraries like Flutter hooks or the likes. The third method is the that only method. It uses only the Riverpod dependency. It's a version of Riverpod with all the classes related to Flutter stripped out, so you have only just the Riverpod library. Depending on the package that you choose, you would want to use these different libraries, but I think I would recommend using the Flutter hooks with Riverpod, as it gives you less code and faster ways of implementing Riverpod with your projects, and also it gives you very clean code with less boilerplate code and less repetitions. Before choosing a configuration, you would have to probably go through a decision flowchart such as this. Everything depends on if you're using Flutter or if you're using Flutter hooks. So the first question is, do you use Flutter? If the answer is no, then you don't need to use any other thing apart from the the Riverpod library. That's the core Riverpod library. Then if you're using Flutter hooks, you would need to use a combination of, if you're using Flutter actually, you would need to answer a question, which is, do you use Flutter hooks? If your answer to that question is yes, then you would need to use two libraries, which is the Flutter hooks library and the hooks Riverpod library. Or if your answer to that question is no, you would need to use only the Flutter Riverpod library. So the next section is Riverpod concepts in Riverpod. The next section is concepts in Riverpod. The first concepts, the first major concept in Riverpod is the provider. We've been talking a lot about providers, so we might as well explain what this provider is. A provider is basically an object that encapsulates a piece of state and allows listening to that particular state. So what a provider does is that a provider takes this particular state, it encapsulates it, and also it gives you access to listen to this particular state and then modify this state later. There are lots and lots and different types of providers. For example, we have the plain provider widgets. This is just a widget that takes any value at all and houses that value, gives you access to modify the states, gives you access to change the value of the object this particular provider is housing later. Then we have a chain notifier provider, we have a state notifier provider, we have a state provider. There are lots and lots and different types of providers. You could check out some of them in the documentation of Riverpod. But one thing to note is that each of these different providers have different uses and different use cases, so you might need to check each of them out to know which particular provider you need. And this kind of provider might actually be different from this other one. You check their uses, check how they are being used. For example, the chain notifier provider, which is a specific type of provider, and it listens to objects and rebuilds independent widgets. And then also when it is being rebuilt, it gives you access to a chain notifier listener, gives you access to these particular different widgets that could handle this state. A chain notifier provider is a specific type of provider which will listen to the state of an object and rebuild dependent widgets when this object has been updated. Also, it automatically call dispose method when needed. Okay, then we have uses of provider. There are so many different uses of provider, but this is like simple or the simplest uses of provider. Number one is it allows easily accessing states in multiple locations, and also providers help to totally replace patterns like singletons, service locators, dependency injections. So what this means is that provider helps you to reduce and replace old patterns like singletons, service locators like get it, and dependency injectors. Also, you don't need to use most of these patterns when working with providers because you could easily access the states of, or you could easily access these providers without the use of any dependency injections or any service locators. Number two is it simplifies combining states with others. So providers give us like an easy way to handle combining multiple providers in one, or using a provider inside an existing provider, using a new provider inside an existing provider. The third one is it enables performance optimizations. This is because we only use what we want at every particular time. We don't need to take all the values in a particular provider. We could only take only one, and then when we use this particular provider, we can optimize our application because you're only using specific things at specific places. The fourth one is it increases the testability of your applications. So providers help to increase the testability of your applications by giving you different methods to test applications, whether either if you have if you're using the existing provider implementations, or if you're using the existing Flutter test libraries, or you're using an external library like Mockito for your test. Provider gives you the option, Riverpod gives you the option to modify these providers, to override this providers, override by, you have like an existing provider and then you need to write a test for that particular provider. You don't need to start creating a new provider for it. You could easily override the existing provider and modify the state. Then we have reading a provider. There are different methods of reading providers, and all these methods depend on the kind of widget you're listening to, or the kind of widget you're using, sorry, this provider in, the configuration of Riverpod you choose while starting up your project. Um, there are different types of questions you can ask yourself, like where are you trying to read the provider? Should the value be exposed? Are you trying to listen to a provider to show dialogues? Are you inside the build method of your provider? Are you outside the build method of your provider? Are you using Flutter hooks or not? There are like lots and lots of different ways to read a provider, each of them depending on different questions, and yeah, different methods also of reading this provider. So a simple way of using providers based on the selection of or configuration of Riverpod is, for example, the first one is using the consumer widget. So the consumer widget is given to us when we choose to use Riverpod without uh, Flutter hooks. So that's just only one library, that's the Flutter Riverpod library. This consumer widget is a base class for widgets. It's similar to a stateless widget, but it allows you to listen to providers. The first thing we could say about this is instead of extending stateless widgets, the home widget here extends the consumer widget. This consumer widget then further modifies the build method to contain a watch value. This watch value is a scoped reader. This scoped reader is what helps us read our provider. So you can see we already defined our counter provider as a state provider, and the state provider houses the value of our count and our initial count, which is 0. Then we can easily listen to this count by using the watch method to listen to the counter provider and then check its state, which is the count of this particular counter provider, and then we could then consume it in our text and show the value of the count using this particular method. The second method, and you can see straight up that it has less code, is that is using Flutter hook stroke hooks Riverpod, which is an alternative to using the consumer widgets. Instead of using like the watch method with a consumer widget, we get to use our hook widgets. This hook widget is only given to us by the Flutter hooks library. Using this particular implementation or configuration of Riverpod, we are able to use this hook widget. We are able to then use the use provider method. This use provider method is a method that's exposed from the Flutter hooks library and the hooks Riverpod library. It gives us a way to consume the counter provider, exposing its state. Thereby, we can use the value of the count in our text widgets. The second concept I'd like to talk about is provider modifiers. So provider modifiers are like different sets of methods that we can attach, or different types of static methods that we can attach to providers that could give us access to more features, like for example the family or the .family modifier, which allows creating a provider from external parameters. What this means is that normally providers house initial values such as an empty state or an integer or a string or just an empty view model. But the family method gives us a way to add existing values to this provider. For example, we have the final hello world provider, sorry, the final hello provider. Then we have the provider.family, which gives us a way to add the title. So this title will not be there if we were using a regular provider, but since we use the family modifier, we can now add a title string, and then this string will be able to house the state of this particular or be housed rather in state of this particular provider. The second one is the auto dispose, which is really cool. The auto dispose, which makes the provider automatically destroy states when it's no longer in use or when it's no longer being listened to. So what this does is it is basically creates a provider that you could use. Then when you stop reading or when you stop listening to it, or when your view probably changes, it disposes this particular provider, and then it doesn't use this particular provider anymore because your state has changed. Sorry, your state, not because your state has changed, but because this provider has been disposed or the state is no longer being listened to. Riverpod in action is a way to show Riverpod and show how it's being used in different examples and different ways of handling data in Riverpod. There are lots of explanations to be done here, but I think probably the docs will be able to explain more on how to use Riverpod in its entirety. The first example is using the Flutter hooks and the hooks Riverpod library to build a simple Hello World application. So right away we could see that we have our provider already defined. This is one of the cool things about using Riverpod. It gives us access to create our provider anywhere, and basically the provider is a value, just one value, which you could use to consume. It's probably always good to define it as a final variable, and then call the particular provider we need, like the hello world provider, which houses a string. This particular provider could house anything, not just a string. Uh, the final hello world provider. Sorry. Okay, so we have the hello world provider. This hello world provider can give us the hello world string. The second thing to also notice is the provider scope widget, which is wrapped around my app. This is like the most important widgets when using Riverpod. This is where the state of the providers will be stored. You would always need to wrap your my app widgets or any widget that is directly under your own app when you're working with Riverpod. The second thing we could notice about this scope widget is that it's actually above the material app. This helps us to be able to access the different states and store them, or this helps Riverpod rather to access the different states and store them and be able to give us access to modify the states later. Looking at the my app widget, we could also see that it extends the hook widget instead of using the normal stateless widgets. Like I've explained before, the hook widget is given to us by the Flutter hooks library. It's a type of stateless widget that reduces boilerplate code while working with Flutter hooks. So because we are using a hook widget, we could easily use the useProvider method. This useProvider method would be able to read this particular value from the provider, give us the states, and then we could use the states on our text widget. The second example is very similar to the first one, but the only difference is that instead of using a Flutter Riverpod with Riverpod hooks, we are now using just only a Flutter Riverpod library. Or sorry, instead of using the hooks Riverpod with Flutter hooks, now we are using just the Flutter Riverpod library. As we can also see, we have still the same hello world provider. We still have the we still have the provider scope widget, which is wrapped around the my app widget. But the major difference is, instead of using a hook widget, we can now see the my app widget is extending a consumer widget, and also we have an extra value in our build method called the watch method. The watch method, which has data type of a scoped reader, which gives us access to watch this our provider. And also this particular consumer widget is exposed by the Flutter Riverpod library. It's basically the same, gives us the same thing as what the hooks widget does with the use provider. So instead of using hook widgets with the Flutter hook library, you could use a consumer widget here, and then we'd use the watch method to listen to this particular provider, get the value, and use the value in our text. Then this is the third example. The third example is Riverpod being used in a plain DAT project. This project doesn't have any connections with Flutter, and all it has is just DAT. It's a plain DAT project. But we can still be able to manage our states using Riverpod. This is one of the very cool features about using Riverpod. You could use it in a plain DAT project. So you don't need to have Flutter in your project. It strips out all the Flutter libraries required for handling providers and modifying states, and just gives us a simple way of handling states in that, which is the provider container. This provider container is an object where the state of our providers will be stored, and thanks to this container, we'll be able to use the container.read method to be able to read the hello world provider and then get the value of the hello world provider from this provider container. Then the fourth one, and I think this is the longest example, is using providers with tests. So there are like lots of different things, and first thing we should note is that when working with providers in test environment or using a provider container, you should probably only use just one provider container for one value. That you shouldn't reuse this provider containers. So that's like something to note when working with this. But this particular example is like a counter application with just only the DAT test library and the Flutter test library. There's no, the DAT test library, there's no dependency on Flutter on this project. All we have is just test methods like the test, and then we can also expect and verify values here. We can listen to values, we can watch and change values using provider and using Riverpod's providers to manage states, listen to the different states of values in the test environment, and then handle these different states. Then for further reading, I think you should check out riverpod.dev. There are like different methods, different ways of handling providers. There are also different ways of combining these different providers. The explanations are really, really, really long. I don't think I'll be able to cover all of them in this talk. But if you could check out riverpod.dev, you would find out that there are lots and lots of explanations on how to use providers, how to handle, how to select specific providers for specific select specific values from specific providers and use these values in your views. So thank you.